First, cut the front and back apart. I'm cutting down the middle of the shoulder and now the side seam in the middle of the green tape. To create a bust dart from the shoulder to the bust line, which is also called the apex, cut in the dead center of the green line all the way to the bust line. Now I'm cutting up the green line from the hip to the bust line, leaving just enough tape to hold the two together. I also need to cut along the waistline so that it will spread. I'm trying to make the taped shell flat, and this is a little different than the draped torso sloper, which also will be taught. Now I've cut the back shoulder down a few inches and cutting up the back green line. That's where the dart will be, in the back. Tien has a very small body, so she doesn't need too many darts. If a woman was very large busted, then there would be probably 2 darts down the back and down the front, in the back to accommodate a full hip area. As you see, this is starting to become flat now. I'm measuring the distance between the bust and the waist. I have a very faint grid under my white paper, but if you do not have a grid, just draw a line. This will be the center front line where I will put the center front of the taped shell, the green line, up against. And that line needs to be parallel to the edge of the paper. I'm marking the bust line, measuring down to the waistline. And down to the hip line. The taped shell is easy to do. However, it's a bit crude at times, so you will have to sort of refine the shapes, which I will be addressing. I want the bust line to go clear across the paper to accommodate the front and the back. And the same for the waist. Just to make sure it's absolutely correct. Sometimes the L shape ruler will shift a tiny bit and then your measurements will be off. So I always double check. I'm double checking from the bust line down to the waistline to make sure the L square is perfectly perpendicular to the center front line. And now I will make a hip line. The actual body waist is not a straight line, but to manipulate patterns, it's better to start with a straight line and then accommodate for the particular body that you're working with. As you see, I'm lining the bust and the waist and the hip lines up against the center front line that I've drawn on the white paper, and with tacking it down. The board that I have under the paper is called Homasote. It can be bought in hardware stores or lumber yards, and it's very large and has to be cut down. It's compressed cardboard, so it's easy to push pins into. As you see on the side seam at the waist, the line goes a little bit above the corrected straight line, but we'll work all of this out. What I'm doing right now is trying to get the shapes in the full part of the darts at the waist, and then in a moment above the bust at the shoulder. I'm measuring the distance between to note what that dart will be. That will be a dart from the shoulder to the bust. Just comparing. First, lightly I'll pencil in, and then I'll use my tools to make the lines and curves very pristine and exact. I'm using my tracing wheel to go around the outside of the tape, the green tape. And I marked the top of the blue because the armhole where the green tape is looks like it's going into a V shape at the bottom, and I really need that to be a right angle to the side seam. Tracing the side seam down. Marking where the hip is. I'm marking now from the center front to where the shoulder dart ends on the bust line, also called the apex line. This is at the waist, where the apex line meets that tip of the bust dart. There will be a straight line down through the waist dart. So if the taped sloper is not perfect, which it's very hard to get it perfect until you put it to paper, it has to be corrected a little bit. So if you note up at the bust line, from the center front over to that dot, I'm going to make a straight line parallel to center front, straight down the sloper. Then I'm going to fill in the shoulder to bust dart. I want to make sure that my shoulder on either side of that dart are the same measurements. bust to shoulder and bust to shoulder. The width at the top on this particular sloper for this particular model happens to be 2 inches. A bigger busted woman would take more intake. Now I'm measuring the width of the dart. This is called a fisheye dart because it starts at 0, comes down to a wider part at the waist, and then goes back to 0 at the hip. This is a fisheye dart. I want to find the width of it and split the difference from one side to the other of the center line. Now, what I have also decided is Tian does not need the dart to go all the way down to the hip. She's a very small person and doesn't have too much body mass to make many bulges. A fuller figured woman, I would, as I mentioned before, take the dart from the waist all the way through the hips down to the bottom of the sloper. But I'm going to make Tian's waist to below the waist dart about 4.5 inches. And we'll test this in muslin. Now what I'm doing is putting the sloper back together because I'm ending the dart about 4 inches below the waist, so it doesn't need to be wider at the very hip, wider than the original sloper. Now I have accommodated for the fullness of the dart at the waist and 0 dart below the waist dart, about 4.5 inches down from the waist and above the hips. Erasing the old line. What I'm doing here is looking at the underarm seam to see where that armhole in the front ends. And as I mentioned, I don't really love the shape of it. It's coming to a V, but we'll pencil it in for now, compare it to the back armhole, and find where a good balance is. Once again, testing in muslin, I'll know if I've hit the mark or need to reshape the armhole. A right angle at center front neck for approximately 1/2 inch. Unless you have a V-neck, you always have a right angle at the center front neck and the center back neck. I'm writing the distance, the width of each segment of the shoulder. It's always good to have a lot of information on your slopers and patterns, like armhole measurements, neck measurements, shoulder measurements, etc. It makes it much easier when you're developing a pattern to have that measurement in front of you so that you don't have to continually measure. Now, I need to get the shape of the top of the dart. I'm folding on the line closest to the center front and folding it across as if it were fabric being pressed or ironed zero fold at the tip, at the apex line, and then the complete fold at the top of the shoulder. And you can see that the line goes in just a fraction. So I will straighten that up in a minute. Pin or tape shut, then straighten your shoulder. If you use the tracing wheel, it will perforate under the shoulder so you'll get the shape. And while this dart is closed, I'm going to go ahead and add my seam allowance. Cut it at one time, and then you get the perfect shape on the top of the paper pattern as well as at the top of the seam allowance. That was a 3/4 inch shoulder seam. You can use what you'd like. I like to use 3/4 on a shoulder because if it's a little bit tight, there's something to let out. I'm erasing the old pencil mark that I no longer need. Now you see the shape. With your ruler and pencil, you can fill in where the perforations are. CF center front, and I always put an arrow right exactly where the center front line is, and I put my initials CF or right out center front on that line. If you put it in the body, it might be easy to forget where that line is. Now let's start on the back. Drawing a center back line, marking my hip, waist, and bust lines. You can usually find grid paper at an art supply store, or some wrapping papers have a 1-inch grid on the back of the wrapping. You can use that and put your white paper, your tracing paper on top of it. It helps to maintain perfect right angles and good grain lines. Center back. With push pins, I'm placing the center back of the torso taped sloper onto the center back line of the paper. spreading the shoulder dart approximately 1/2 inch. 1/2 inch is pretty standard for the shoulder dart. Now I see that the buttocks area is still puffy. There's a bubble in it, and it's got to be flat. So I'm just slashing in the middle for now, and I'll show you how to correct that shape as we go along. But you can see the dart from the bust to about 4 or 5 inches below the waist. That's starting to look like a nice dart. Lightly outline the neck, the shoulder, the back neck dart, the armhole. I'm marking the width of the waist dart. And if you notice where I put the dot right there at the bottom, about 4 inches below, that's where the torso sloper naturally seems to come back together. That's showing me that that's the end of her dart. And I will close the bottom in a few moments. Now I'm going to reestablish the front with the side seams facing each other. Tack down the hip, the bust, and compare. What I'm noticing is the armholes are at a different height. So I'm measuring the front, measuring the back, and marking where the higher one is. I'd rather start with a higher armhole and then cut it down if it doesn't work well on the model. A right angle at the center back neck for about 1/2 inch, filling in the pencil lines with the curve so we have a really nice curve. Over time, you'll learn to look at the different shapes of different bodies. Some people have a shorter, rounder neck. Other people have a thin, more cylindrical neck. And the shapes that you will make for them in their patterns will accommodate the shapes of their body. As you learn, you'll get better at this. So from the back neck at the shoulder, I have gone over the same distance from the shoulder neck meeting to the first dart leg of the shoulder dart. Then there's a 1/2 inch for the shoulder dart, and then the rest of the shoulder is the same amount as the front. Now I'm marking the underarms where I think they should meet. To get the shape of the dart at the back neck shoulder area, fold on the leg closest to the center back. Fold it shut as if you were pressing it with an iron. Go over the lines with pencil and then your tracing wheel. And then when you open it, you'll have the shape of the dart. Use your ruler and pencil to fill in the perforations. I really love both of these curves. The silver one often makes glare on the film, so I tend to use the plastic one more, but the silver one is my favorite for armholes. Still kind of deciding where I want the underarm to end. But I have lifted it in the back, and at some point the back and front will match. Now what I'm doing is I'm matching the side seams, and I'm also matching the bust, waist, and hip. I want to compare the shapes and the lengths of the seam from the hip to the underarm. So you see there's a discrepancy. What to do? I'm going to come right between them. And I'm making the shapes basically the same. The back hip may be a little bit fuller, but the shape is the same if you lay the side seams on top of each other. I'm measuring from the center back of the waist to the center of the waist dart. I want to find out where to place that length line, vertical line, right there in the center. And then create the vertical line about 6 or 7 inches above the waist, and depending on the shape of the hip, 4.5 to 6.5 inches below. Hers is 4.5, just about 4.5 inches. Again, TN's very small. If someone has a larger buttock area, usually you make a shorter dart so that you have more fabric below the waist. But it just depends upon the shape of the body. So straight lines from the waist to the bust area, and then I'm curving the dart from the waist to the bottom of the hip dart to accommodate for the roundness of the buttocks. Now I'm going to make what's called a horizontal balance line. It's about 4 inches below the base of the neck in the back, perpendicular to the center back line. This is another line that we use when we correct patterns, and I will explain that much more in depth as we move through the process of fitting and making clothing. It's also a good area for yokes. Okay, there's my final line. I've split the difference. If you notice, the underarm in the front is actually a shorter line. Not the underarm, the curve of the armhole is shorter in the front than the back. We'll be learning more about this with sleeves. I like to put red ink or pencil over my center front and center back lines. It just is a better way to visualize. Now see the bust, waist, and hips all align. And the underarms come to the same point, above the bust line. I'm making 1-inch seam allowances down the sides so that when I put this to muslin and fit TN, if it needs to be let out, I have a nice big seam allowance to let it out. The armholes, I'm only giving a 1/2 inch. Since I did not put seam allowance on the shoulder line in the back when I trued the dart, folded it, and drew it with the pencil, the correct line and shape, I pinned the dart shut and will establish the seam allowance. I'm giving her 1/2 inch at the neckline so that I can adjust the neckline if necessary. I'm writing the amounts, the widths on either side of the dart, and those widths should match the front. That was a right angle to the shoulder seam. Half of an inch seam allowance around the front armhole. in a right angle right under the arm, perpendicular to the side seam. 1/2 inch around the neck. What I'm doing here is putting the front that does not have the side seam allowance marked yet on top of the back, which does have the seam allowance marked. The shapes and the lengths are the same, so by seeing one under the other, I can cut, as you will see, so that they're the same, exactly the same. Pin them together so they don't shift. Although you can't see it, what I'm doing is snipping under the arms at the armhole so that the very top of the side seam is cut at the very same place on both front and back. Now what I'm going to do is establish a hem. I think about 1.5 should be good. I'm marking basically that will be a 1 1/2 inch mark in a moment. Cut together while they're still pinned. One 1/2 inch hem, 1 1/2 hem. I'm also marking the hip line, the waistline, bust line, also called apex line, horizontal balance line. Now I'm going to fill in notches. On professional patterns, our notches are actually a tiny little snip into the fabric, or later I will show you how to mark things with thread. But what I'm doing is marking at the top. First I marked the shoulder seam, then the center front, the top of the darts, following the ruler, the shoulder, following the ruler under the arm. I'm laying the ruler against these seams and just following the line out to the edge of the paper, making about a 1/4 inch line with a little crossbar. The crossbar shows you where to stop your cut. Actually laying the ruler against the legs of the dart, the shoulder seam, the center back neck, the hip line, the underarm following the side seam of the back, Now I'm going to measure the armhole. First, the front. If you notice, I'm standing the tape measure on its side with the numbers touching the paper. I'm measuring the armhole, not including the seam allowance. I'm drawing it in pencil and circling it. Now the back, from the underarm around that curve very, very carefully. Sometimes I measure 2 or 3 times to make sure I'm exact in my measurement. This will be very important when I start to draft sleeves. I could have measured the neck, but that may be changed with the muslin fitting, so it's fine as it is. The model's or client's name, sloper front, name, sloper back. We usually make our slopers for the right side of the body.